Is there anybody out there? And if there is, what does that mean for us? We often see ourselves as a superior species, that humans are the dominant intelligence. We believe that we're singular, special, exceptional even. But what if we aren't? What would the implications be for humanity if intelligent life is discovered somewhere in the cosmos? I'm Soraya Salam, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
We used to joke when I was a postdoc at a NASA research center, and there were some stories out there about, NASA's detected extraterrestrial life, but they're keeping it secret. No way anybody would have any motivation or would obey any command or any ability to keep a secret like that.
So jinn are, in Islamic theology, they are an intelligent being that inhabits Earth. So they're crypto-terrestrials, not extraterrestrials. And they have interactions with human beings.
Imagine we had a spacecraft entering the solar system. Even if they were not sending out any radio messages or any light signals, if you're not communicating at all, it can actually sort of make you appear even more suspicious, or potentially even more threatening.
Let's suppose that we were visited by another civilization and they come here and their craft gets impacted by a lot of our debris, and then they say to themselves, hey, this planet's got a kind of defensive shield and they've just wiped out. We were coming here to do a peaceful first contact and they've just destroyed our ship because they've got all these particles orbiting at high speed and they've just ripped us up.
Our question today: if we discover that we are not the most intelligent species, what does that mean for us? I'd like to introduce our guests. Sheikh Hamza Karamali is the founder of Basira Education. Matthias Detterman is a historian at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar, specializing in the history of science.
Thank you.
David Grinspoon is an astrobiologist at the Planetary Science Institute and is working with NASA.
Thanks.
And Nick Pope has investigated UFOs, now known as UAPs, for the UK Ministry of Defence.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us today. Nick, I want to start with you. For decades, when people talked about intelligent life beyond Earth, they used the phrase extraterrestrial intelligence. But over the last few years, governments, especially in the US, have stopped using that term, and they use the phrase now non-human intelligence. What does that mean? Why the switch? And do you believe in its existence?
Well, I think non-human intelligence originated with one of the many whistleblowers who have come forward out of the US intelligence community. And this particular one is David Grush. And he introduced the term in one of the many congressional hearings that we've had about this. And he used the phrase non-human intelligence, or NHI, precisely to get away from the idea that this was perhaps extraterrestrial. And he said, well, that's just one of a number of competing theories. But what if we're dealing with something else, something other than ourselves, but an intelligence that might be from another dimension, from a different time, or that even might be something demonic, or might be something that we just simply don't have the words or the concepts to describe or understand. So in a way, extraterrestrial was limiting. Non-human intelligence widens the debate.
And do you believe in non-human intelligence existing today?
Yes, I do. I mean, I think, at risk of straying into areas where others are more expert than I, but I think that the laws of physics seem to be constant in the observable universe. Unless we thought there was something almost literally magical in a Harry Potter sense about Earth, and clearly there isn't, the factors that gave rise to life here should replicate elsewhere. And although we don't know precisely what those factors are, life seems to have arisen quickly and hopefully easily here on Earth. And again, there's no reason to suppose that it won't happen out there. The more we know, the more we learn about the universe, the more ordinary we actually appear. And therefore the Copernican principle should apply. And we're probably just average. And if there's life here, there's probably life elsewhere. And some of it, in a universe nearly 14 billion years old, is probably going to be smarter than us.
Given that you investigated UFO sightings, or UAP, which you can explain why the switch in that language, have you ever had a personal experience with these beings?
I've never seen anything unusual myself, but I have investigated hundreds of cases for the British government. We changed the terminology. We talked about extraterrestrial to NHI. We changed from UFO to UAP to get away from the pop culture baggage that the term UFO had acquired over the years. It was just associated with science fiction and conspiracy theory. And again, we felt that that was unhelpful. So we changed, not necessarily for the public and the media, but really internally in the Ministry of Defense, to get this subject taken more seriously, to UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, and now the US government has changed it again to unidentified anomalous phenomena.
David, do you believe in the existence of non-human intelligence?
Well, definitely, for a number of reasons. First of all, there's obviously non-human intelligence on Earth. There are whales and cetaceans and other species are intelligent. And I'm not being facetious here. I think when we use the word intelligent, we have to think deeply about what we mean. And if we're not just referring to humans and considering other life in the universe, then we can look at other life on Earth and try to put our own intelligence in that context. So obviously there's non-human intelligence even on this planet. And but
superior to our own?
Well, in some ways, I mean, what do we mean by superior? If we're looking at sort of a linear scale, can I say that cetaceans are not superior to humans? It's an interesting question. It depends on what you mean by that. But I think what you're getting at is the question of intelligence elsewhere in the universe that has developed far beyond what our capabilities here, and certainly I believe that that's almost inevitably exists, just given what you just said about the time scale of evolution in the universe and the vastness of the universe, that as we now know, there are so many planets, and there's nothing that we understand to be so unique about this planet that the evolution of life and intelligence should be confined here. So just on a sort of probabilistic level, the idea that we would be the sort of apotheosis of evolution and the apotheosis of intelligence seems incredibly unlikely. So if I had to make an informed guess, which I do all the time, I would say, yes, there's other intelligence out there that's vastly superior to our own. Have I seen evidence that that confirms that? No. Am I open to finding it? Absolutely. And in fact, I very much want to. So, when you ask me if I believe in it as a scientist, in a certain sense, I need evidence to say I really believe in it. But if I had to place money, if I was describing my sense of what's probably out there in the universe, I would say absolutely.
I don't know if you can answer this, but have your colleagues at NASA ever experienced non-human intelligence? Or
I can't answer that definitively, and the answer is no. There have been a few intriguing observations of phenomena in other star systems, even a few in our own solar system that have caught our attention and caused people to want to investigate more carefully. But upon further examination, there's been nothing that has convinced the scientific community, convinced me that we've found evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. We are looking. we are increasing our ability to search in ways that give me some optimism that we may be able to detect it soon. But we have not, at this point, found anything that makes us say, aha, that's evidence of intelligent aliens out there.
Matthias, what about you?
Well, I definitely believe that there are non-human intelligences out there. David talked about whales, for instance, but obviously we're only at the beginning of this age of artificial intelligence that we're entering. And it is interesting that the term non-human intelligence also arose at a time when the term AI, artificial intelligence, is becoming so prominent. So we are only at the beginnings of what computing can do, right? We've had modern electronic computers for not even 100 years,
Sure.
right?
What about extraterrestrial intelligence, though?
It is very likely that an advanced extraterrestrial civilization would not just be a biological civilization, but would also be a technological, high-tech civilization. And in fact, researchers in the field of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI, are not just looking for biosignatures, they're also looking for technosignatures. And just like our own civilization has only sent robotic spacecraft to other planets so far because of problems with cosmic rays on biological systems, it is possible, it is maybe even likely that other biological beings would have also sent out robotic spacecraft first before they would have sent biological beings to other planets or star systems.
Sheikh Hamza, when you hear someone like Nick say that the switch to the phrase non-human intelligence is a recognition of the potential of multidimensional beings, maybe demonic beings, does that surprise you to hear that?
No, I mean, so there's in Indonesia, there's a UFO sighting community there since the 1950s. And Indonesia is a Muslim country, and so they tried to look at how to reconcile what they're observing with their religious commitments. And so they put forward a number of different hypotheses, and one of the hypotheses is called the jinn hypothesis. So jinn are, in Islamic theology, they are an intelligent being that inhabits Earth. So they're cryptoterrestrials, not extraterrestrials. And they have interactions with human beings. So I think that the UAP problem, when it's approached from a defense perspective, then we're looking at these phenomena. We're trying to figure out how to protect our national security against threats from a possibly aggressive country, other kinds of weapons. So from a religious perspective, the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet Muhammad, he taught us to be conscious of the existence of jinn. So when we eat our food, we say the name of God upon it. Otherwise, these other beings, they partake in the food with us. When we enter the house, we remember God. Otherwise, these other beings, they enter the house with us. These beings, they have, there's stories that are told in our literature about abductions. They take on different forms. They have advanced technologies. They're mentioned in the Quran as the Prophet Solomon. He had control over them. So they were great builders. They had an association with water. A lot of UFO sightings are associated with water. So I appreciate the widening of extraterrestrial to non-human, because I think like that's where I would suspect. But it's a hypothesis. I mean, it needs further exploration.
But beyond jinn and beyond what's in Islamic literature, do you believe in the possibility of life on other planets, on other intelligent beings that exist beyond humans and jinn?
I think it is a possibility. I think scientists will tell us about that. I think what there's from an so in the Muslim scholarly tradition, I appreciated what David said about scientists following the evidence. So religion is often painted as being something that's based on faith or an emotional thing, search for meaning and awe. But in Muslim scholarly tradition, there's we believe that that our religious commitments need to be based on evidence. But the kind of evidence that we use is first a kind of metaphysical reasoning. So we would look at the scientific explanations that we give, like the sun shines because of nuclear fusion. So this is explaining one natural phenomenon with another natural phenomenon that itself needs to be explained by some other natural phenomenon. So when we explain the things in the universe with the things in the universe, it doesn't give an explanation, because you can't explain dependent things with a never-ending series of dependent things. And so that shows that there is metaphysically something, a being that sustains everything, that makes everything happen. And so we call that a necessary being. And just as the possibility of alien life, we wonder, well, are they out there? Are they communicating with us? With this being whose existence we arrive at through reason, it's natural to wonder, does he communicate with us? And so there was a figure, his name was Muhammad. He's a historical figure, 7th century Arabia. And he brought signs, he brought miracles to prove that he has revelation from that being. And there's all of this. We have a long-standing historical critical method where we verify these reports. And so from this perspective, when I look at something like this, then I would look at the scientific evidence, but I would also look at the theological evidence to see what it has to say about the matter, to get a complete picture of it. So when I look at it from a theological perspective, then the existence of extraterrestrial intelligent life is a possibility. It falls within the power of God to create something like that. But there's verses of the Quran that would seem to indicate that they do exist, and Muslim scholars have actually been very comfortable with the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence. There's a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ خَلْقُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَمَا بَثَّ فِيهِمَا مِنْ دَابَّةٍ. So which means that from his signs are the creation of the earth, this is where we are, and the heavens. So we look up at the heavens, that's where all the planets are. And he says that, and all of the walking creatures that he has dispersed in both of them. So which many scholars, they thought that maybe it indicates that there are other beings that walk on other lands. Professor Matthias, you mentioned the Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, right? So Alameen, in the beginning of Surah Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, praise be to God, who is the Lord of the Alameen. Alam are worlds of existence, and in the Arabic language, the plural that's used here is used for intelligent beings, because when you have some kind of sound masculine plural, it's used for intelligent beings. And so humans, jinn, angels, and there's a possibility that there's other kinds of beings as well. So the existence of extraterrestrial life, it's a possibility, and I guess I await the verdict of the scientists on on its existence.
Nick, I'm wondering why this conversation has entered the mainstream in the past several years, in the past decade. Why are governments suddenly so urgently investing money into this kind of research?
Well, I think the center of gravity of this undeniably is coming from the United States at the moment. And I think there have been a number of things that have happened in parallel. Firstly, we've had whistleblowers coming forward, former government employees speaking to the reality of this. Now, there have been whistleblowers before, but frankly, a lot of them have their testimony and indeed they themselves have been fairly dubious and certainly disputed. But the people now do seem to be who they say they are, and they do seem to have done this subject genuinely, verifiably, from within the government, the military, and the intelligence community. But I think it's the congressional engagement that is really moving this forward. Now, in the United States Congress, there is the Senate and the House. And within these two bodies, there are committees, for example, intelligence committees, armed services committees, oversight committees. And all of these committees have been involved actively in this subject. There have been classified briefings behind closed doors, but also open public hearings. There have been UAP-related provisions in successive National Defense Authorization Acts over the last 3, 4, 5 years now. Now, that's
but why?
I realized when I answer that I'm giving you the what, but I'm not really giving you the why. The honest answer is I don't know why. The suspicion, I think, is that maybe they know or strongly suspect something, or that this is just a conversation that's time has come for it, and maybe it's got something to do. You mentioned artificial intelligence. We have obviously, also the fact that we now see further out and further back in time than ever with instruments such as the James Webb Space Telescope. So maybe it's just time that we had this conversation, that we took it away from the purview of conspiracy theorists and science fiction writers, and we throw it open to scientists, to religious scholars, to ordinary people all around the world, because there is no doubt in my mind that this is one of the biggest and most profound questions we can ask ourselves as human beings. And also, if we find the answer to this, it is going to be one of the deepest and most profound changes in human history, and it's going to impact in ways that we can't possibly guess, but almost every aspect of our society: politics, religion, science, technology, the economy, philosophy, arts and entertainment, everything. The world will change.
In what way?
In every way. I think we will, if future historians look back, and if we get across that line, and I don't know how it will happen, the UFO community or UAP community talk about disclosure. The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Committee might pick up a signal, or we might detect a techno signature, or we might have, something out of science fiction, like the archetypal landing on the White House lawn. But future historians will look back on that moment, however this transpires, and they will say there was the day before, and then there was the day after. And I don't have a crystal ball because there are so many variables. We don't know whether it's going to be one intelligence or multiple intelligences. We don't know whether it's going to be extraterrestrial or some of these other things. We don't know whether they're going to be friendly, hostile, neutral. So there are so many variables we can't predict, but I think the only safe prediction is to say that it will be deeply impactful for almost everyone.
David, what does the day after look like if humanity discovers evidence of non-human intelligence?
I mean, first I have to say there's something odd about, it's true that we've heard about these whistleblowers, but they haven't produced any evidence. You hear stories, and it's usually, I talked to somebody else who saw this top secret thing that blew their mind, but nobody's come out and said, look, here's some evidence of some actual craft and some extraterrestrial manifestation here on Earth. And it's a conspicuous lack of evidence, because there are people in my community who do nothing but watch the sky and do nothing but try to sense the Earth's environment with every kind of sensor they can come up with.
What evidence would satisfy you, though?
Well, some decent images. I mean, everyone's got cell phones these days? Why aren't there decent images if these things are buzzing all around? And yet some pilots clearly see some things they're puzzled by. I've talked to some pilots that have seen things they're puzzled by, but it's very frustrating, whatever it is.
I agree on that.
But didn't the U.S.
anecdotal.
release video?
Yeah, but they were grainy and subject to misinterpretation. And in fact, I was on a NASA UAP independent committee that looked at some of those, and in fact, a lot of what's been said about them is illusory because, there's something called parallax where the motion of the observer can make something look like it's moving at ridiculous speeds when in fact it's not. And so when you actually, what's been released, when you analyze it, it's not nearly as convincing or impressive as what some of the news reports made it sound like.
I agree on that. But sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, of course, without wanting to go too deep down a conspiracy rabbit hole, what we don't know is what may have been presented in any of the classified briefings that Congress has received, which certainly seems to have shaken, if you look at the language and the body language even, of some of the people who've received those classified briefings. But I agree that publicly we don't yet have a smoking gun.
When we had our UAP independent commission, we were not given classified information because it was a public investigation, but we did interface with some people from the security community who had access to the classified information. And the strong sense you get is what they're mostly protecting is their methods of investigation and their technical capabilities that they don't want the enemies to know about. So that's not the same thing as evidence of absence. I don't have evidence of absence, but the absence of evidence is peculiar to me. So I just wanted to say that. But in answer to your question about what the day after would be, because I do think, as Nick has said, that it will be a profound moment when we establish the existence of other intelligence in the universe. And I do think that is something likely to happen. And as Nick said, we don't know how that's going to happen. So I'm in agreement on all that. And I think the day after will probably shake us, maybe in good ways. And I think in detail, it will depend on the nature of that discovery. Because, for instance, if we detect a technosignature out there that isn't somebody trying to message us, but it's just pretty solid evidence that there's somebody out there that's constructed something or modified a planet in some way, so we know that, this isn't the work of bacteria, or it's not a natural planetary manifestation, it's a technological development, that would be really interesting, and it would give us this realization that we're not unique in some way that we thought we might be. And I think that it's been said that would have this sort of uniting effect on the human race, which I like to think could happen. That's very different from if we actually discover an artifact or somebody that's come here to talk to us, or even somebody that's sending a message to us that somebody's trying to interact with us in some way from out there. I think that then it would depend on the nature of the message or the nature of what we learn about them, the effect. But I think it's probably more likely that the first detection would simply be that we know they're out there, but there's been no interaction, maybe no possibility of interaction. And then that would be profound, but not as sort of potentially frightening or potentially revelatory in some other way as an actual potential communication.
Matthias, I know you want to respond, but just briefly, what incentives do you think states might have in controlling the narrative around this conversation?
States would have every incentive to control discourse about a topic that could impact national security in so many different ways, right? We've seen sort of governments trying to sort of desperately trying to stay in control over narrative, over information, over measures. In the case of other major public events, I'm thinking here especially about the COVID-19 pandemic, right, where you had so many unknowns. At the same time, information, news, fake news spreading incredibly fast. In this case, David mentioned, you mentioned your hope that extraterrestrial intelligence sort of could unite humanity. In the case of COVID-19, yes, we saw some humanity-wide efforts through the World Health Organization, but at the same time, the pandemic was incredibly divisive in society, where you had different politicians advocating for different measures, mask wearing, not mask wearing.
It was politicized.
It was incredibly politicized. And something like an extraterrestrial spacecraft entering the solar system, for instance, could be politicized perhaps even more, right? And the fear that so many people often rightly had of COVID-19, just the simple fear of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization coming close to our backyard could be much, much greater.
And what do you think would be the impact on humanity, on our sense of self, culture, identity? Can you go more into that? You know, if this intelligent life is discovered?
I would agree with David here. It depends on the nature of the finding, right? So if we find microbial life under the surface of Mars, it would probably not shake a lot of people in sort of their everyday life. If we find
Until it mutates, of course.
until it mutates, if we find evidence of an advanced spacefaring civilization, so a civilization that would have mastered interstellar travel, then it would put our own civilization very much in perspective. It would make us feel very small. It would make us feel in many ways less special, or at the very least it would make us rethink how special we could still be.
Sheikh Hamza, do you agree? Would it make you feel less small, less special if non-human intelligence or extraterrestrial life was discovered?
Well, I mean, if I say feeling less special, that assumes that I feel like I'm special. So let's if I could like reframe that question, and that human beings, they are the uniqueness and specialness of human beings does not come from their being alone in the universe, but the uniqueness and specialness of human beings comes from their moral responsibility to God. So God sends messengers, and the messengers and messengers, and according to some reports, they're weak reports from the Prophet ﷺ, but scholars have believed them that this chain of messengers is also sent to extraterrestrial beings should they exist. There's a famous hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that there are other earths like this earth, and each earth has an Adam like your Adam, and a Jesus like your Jesus, and a Muhammad like your Muhammad. And so it was. Historical critics didn't accept this as a verified statement of the Prophet ﷺ.
Would they have received the same message?
The message is the messages that God sends. So there's a shared message that everybody has, and this shared message has to do with facts and realities. So facts and realities don't change. So God's existence is a fact and reality. Resurrection after death is a fact and reality. Judgment is a fact and reality. So every prophet and messenger comes with these same facts and realities. The specific commands and prohibitions that God sends his messengers with, they vary from time to time, from place to place, maybe from planet to planet. But I think that, so just to come back, that the uniqueness is, we do have a uniqueness, we do have a distinction, because when I look at the theological evidence alongside the scientific evidence, then there is a distinction that was given to mankind The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is, Muslims believe he's the best of creation. He was chosen to be a human being. When Adam came down to earth, the angels prostrated to him. And God says in the Quran many times that He's created as a favor to us, that He's enabled us to benefit from everything in the heavens and the earth. So the immediate purport of the revelatory evidence is that human beings have a specialness in relation to God, but that specialness is not absolute; it's conditional. So human beings, when they don't act in accordance with God's commands, then they become the worst of beings. It's also mentioned in the Quran. So it's not an intrinsic specialness and intrinsic uniqueness, but it's a potential that we have, and it's also a responsibility. The Prophet ﷺ in the Quran, it says that God sent him as a mercy. It's interesting. It says we sent you as a mercy to all of the alameen, to all of the worlds. So if the intelligent extraterrestrial life is discovered, I'd be very interested in getting to know them, understanding their language, and seeing what information they have, and conveying the message of the Prophet ﷺ to them, just as we do to the rest of mankind.
That assumes that they're willing to listen and peaceful.
Yeah, I'm optimistic.
Yeah,
I mean, why do
no
we
judgment,
always have
but
to
just
make
saying
like a
that
nightmare
Do you think
scenario?
it would be possible that the prophets have also spoken to them, and that we could learn something from them on these topics?
So it's possible that they received prophets. They received information. The key information that we have from prophets is the same, which is that God created us. He gave us moral commands to be good to our neighbors, to show mercy and kindness to other people, and so and that we will be called to judgment after death. So this much would be the same. They would have specific commands that might differ, but the commands of the Prophet Muhammad would supersede those. So we would now be obligated to meet them. So there would actually be an obligation to go out and meet them and talk to them and communicate with them.
Nick, Sheikh Hamza mentioned, or kind of questioned my question, which was, why do we approach this with fear? When you worked for the UK Defense Ministry, was your research coming from a place of fear from the top?
It wasn't coming from a place of fear, but if you, as a government, decide to embed your UAP research and investigation program in the Ministry of Defense, the Department of Defense, you will inevitably get that defense and national security mindset, which is why most countries around the world that have looked at this and are looking at this do precisely that. But not all of them. So, for example, the French government, their program is embedded in the French National Space Center. So you get a much more scientific mindset of this. But I think it's just the consequence of where you put it in government. But a place of fear, I wouldn't say fear, although, of course, it is slightly disconcerting, perhaps, if we realize intellectually that we are not necessarily anymore going to be the top, the alpha, the top of the pile when it comes to life, that there might be civilizations out there with a 1 billion-year head start on us.
David, are we projecting our own deficiencies as a species in terms of every time, there have been dominant powers that discover, less dominant powers, violence ensues? Are we projecting a bit? I mean, why should we assume that these beings would be that way?
Yeah, I think we are. And I think the emphasis on fear, like you said, when you're thinking in a military mindset, that's sort of natural. But to me, the idea that they would want to sort of come here and attack us, that's very science fictional. But it doesn't really make sense when you think of the distances between the stars and, why would this very sophisticated, very presumably aged and probably wise civilization, what would they gain from making war on us primitive humans? And so when you get away from that fear-based mindset, I think there's also a very hopeful aspect. And I think SETI and astrobiology really are imbued with a lot of hope. And I think there's actually a logic, believe it or not, to that hopefulness. And that is that any civilization that we detect out there is almost certainly much more aged than we are. And that's a simple mathematical fact, that we, in this universe that's something like 14 billion years old, we are such babies. We've had the technological ability to search the universe with radio for really, less than a century. And we've had the ability to examine exoplanets for, decades. And so we're very new at this. And we're at a time when our civilization is confronted with some real problems, and there's a lot of uncertainty now. I think justified uncertainty about the long-term, the longevity and survival of our civilization when we're confronted with climate change and all these problems of our own making, and international disunity, and these problems that we need to be coherent as a global civilization to solve, and yet we're obviously not currently being coherent. So there's this sort of question we have: is it possible for a technological civilization to survive for the long term on a planet with itself and integrate gracefully with its planet? If we discover extraterrestrials, it's almost certainly because they've solved that problem. They will have not been decades old, not centuries old. They'll probably be at least millennia old, and perhaps much more aged than that as a technological civilization. And you can do the math and show that that's almost certainly true. So in a way, I think even a detection where we don't know much about them is a very hopeful sign that, it's possible to do this thing, this project of forming a technological global civilization that lasts and doesn't just do itself in. So to me, that hopeful aspect of a detection is more likely than these sort of fear-based stories of invasions and scary military conquests.
Why are we assuming that technological advancement equals like more advanced, and less technologically advanced means somebody's more primitive? I would say that somebody could be extremely technologically advanced and evil and devious and a really bad person, and so I think that the whole thinking behind it is, it's in terms of. I mean, I disagree with that way of looking at it.
Except I think I have an answer to that, which is that the lack of wisdom and and great technological prowess is an unstable mixture. If we're assuming that it's not going to last, you'll do yourselves in. If you have, and Einstein and other people said this, if you have nuclear weapons and but you're still on the sort of sociological level of warring clans, what's the chance that you're going to survive for very long? Arguably, we've been lucky since the beginning of the nuclear age. So there's a need, and I would say currently we are in great need of spiritual growth and of attaining wisdom. So I think you're right that finding technology doesn't make you wise, but I think survival with technology will require wisdom. And that's why I say that an aged extraterrestrial civilization must have figured some things out about how to get along with their planet and with themselves.
So the key thing is the thing that makes somebody wise. It's not their intelligence then, because if you were to take not intelligence, well, maybe intelligence as well, but like technology, that's not the key. That shouldn't be the key thing, right? That's accidental. So let's say that the advanced technology wasn't there, but they lived very harmoniously. They lived in peace. They could, with their environment. Then, even if they were less technologically advanced than us, then it would be a wiser civilization. Like, wouldn't you agree? Or
I absolutely agree.
Right. Yeah. So
it also depends on how do we define intelligence, right? If we define intelligence as the capacity to solve problems, right? Then indeed, I would sort of want to share the hope and the optimism that you have, David, that a very, very old civilization that is very, very intelligent, they would have solved a lot of problems. And because of the complexity of their civilization, this would not just be problems of technology, but this would also be problems of politics, problems of a social nature. Like you said, right? A civilization that would have survived for thousands, millions, maybe even billions of years, despite being incredibly powerful, would have found ways to get along.
Yeah, well, I think this question of how do we define intelligence is key. And we'll come back to this because, cleverness is clearly not enough. Yeah, you can just invent nifty machines, but if you're still a moral infant, then good luck to you. Right? And some would say that's the state of the human race right now. But so what do we mean by intelligence? And yeah, if it's solving problems, then in addition to solving the problem of, how to make gizmos, you have to solve the problem of how to survive and get along as a species with these technological powers.
And how to solve some of the problems that we have on Earth. I mean, the intersectionality of technology and independence and the relationship between them is very interesting. And I think it plays into a wider debate about the nature of altruism and then the follow-up question of how altruistic other civilizations might be. And again, we don't have any answers to that. But I mean, almost any technology, and this is one of the things that interests me, one of the things that we might learn if we find out about other intelligences, whether it's picking up a signal specifically to us, interacting with a civilization, or just tapping in to, I think, what Timothy Ferris called the galactic internet, is what we might find out and then what we do with that. Because almost every technology, for example, that you might use hopefully to acquire interstellar travel or to solve problems like poverty and disease, the flip side of that is that technology might be capable of being weaponized. So it comes back to not only what civilizations are out there and what technologies might they have, but how we make use of it if we ever get our hands on it.
Sheikh Hamza, do you want to respond to that?
I think that there's a lot of imagination that's happening, right? So I think that we are imagining civilizations. We're imagining that they're older, they're wiser, they've been around, they've done all of these things. Maybe they've self-destructed. Maybe they're primitive. Maybe they're just microbes. Maybe so there's and we still haven't actually discovered anything like through direct observation. So I think these are interesting questions. These are interesting questions, but I think that we have a lot to learn from our own wisdom traditions as human beings. And I think that the first place that we should be going to solve our problems is the wisdom that we have that came from prophets and messengers. I think like that's more, it kind of makes more sense. And to me, and I think that we should also be, I would, that if we're searching for, if there's intelligent extraterrestrial life that we're searching for and looking to communicate, I think we should also be searching to communicate with the God who created all of us. And maybe he has a purpose for us. Maybe we can learn something from that. So, that's what I like.
I'm wondering, is there more emphasis or curiosity among those with secular beliefs versus those with religious or spiritual beliefs on this topic?
Curiosity, yeah, maybe there is.
Or I guess from a humanity level, why is this so intriguing to talk about? Why have we been fascinated with this topic for decades, whether it's in pop culture or whether it's, at the office of the Ministry of Defense? What is it about us that is so fascinated with this topic?
Well, I mentioned earlier, it's one of the big questions we can ask ourselves as humans. Are we alone or not in the universe? But I think it speaks, and I say this, whether you are religious and whichever religion you might belong to, or whether you have no religion. I think humans have always, irrespective of where they fall on that spectrum, searched for a wider, a bigger meaning. The idea that there must be more to life than just doing the grocery shopping and going to work. And I think also humans have always looked up at the night sky since the dawn of time and looked with wonder and hope and sometimes fear too, and wondered what might be out there. And some people have looked at that through a religious lens, but others have looked at it in a more secular lens too. But I think it's the search for meaning. That's my answer to your question.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something. To me, it seems like if I were to look at the human species as a little vulnerable thing on a little vulnerable speck in the universe, where there's black holes and there's these terrifying realities that if human beings went up, they wouldn't even survive that. Then am I alone? Am I alone in this big, huge kind of thing? It seems to me, it makes me scared. It makes me, but if so I think like even the question of are we alone in the universe, I think that there is an existential aloneness that comes from a naturalistic view of the universe. But when there is and this isn't to justify the existence of God or not, like I think that needs to be justified separately based on an argument, but a perspective where everything is dependent on a being who is controlling everything and running everything and has given me a purpose and a meaning. Now I don't feel that fear anymore. I feel like I'll be taken care of. I feel I have a direction. I feel like I know where to go. So now the search for extraterrestrial life, it is interesting. It's fascinating. I think you learn a lot. In astrobiology, I never thought it would even be a subject, and I like to follow it. But it's not where I think I'll find meaning. It's not where I think like humanity's problems will be solved. It's something that is, it's unproven imagination, and maybe we're probing all of these things because we're being pushed by this existential loneliness that comes from a naturalistic worldview.
Well, there's an interesting point. I just wanted to say that there are two forces pulling in opposite directions here. We always, on an individual level, many people fear being alone. I think that's primal. And yet, the opposite of that is that we fear the other. So there's an interesting question about how we would reconcile that.
Yeah. Something about the whole question of are we alone, right? Well, we are definitely not alone on this planet, right? So David, right, you mentioned whales, for instance, or you asked the question about sort of like our tools. Do we have the right tools? Well, we don't have the right tools, whether it's technological or whether it's tools related to sort of wisdom or moral tools, to really meaningfully communicate with a lot of the creatures that we're sharing this planet with, right? So we...
what is it about whales specifically? Can you
well, we
expand
know
on
that they have a very sophisticated language. Now, we also know that a lot of other animals communicate. Sort of everybody who lives with animals knows that cats and dogs and birds, etc., communicate. It's a good question what it is about whales. They are very charismatic creatures, right? The blue whale is the biggest animal on this planet.
Well, whales have long been an interest for the SETI community, the people who are interested in searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. Well, for one thing, they've got huge brains. If you look at the brain to body mass ratio, you know, and you can draw it for animals, and whales and humans and other primates are right up there. You know, not that big brains are everything, but it's something we have in common with them, and they do have sophisticated language and apparently culture and songs, and it's clear that they are saying something and thinking something and communicating something, and so. And it is sort of frustrating and puzzling that we haven't been able to crack that code, if it even is a code, when we're talking about theorizing about and strategizing to try to communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence. That we've been frustrated by our inability to understand what the whales are saying.
And deep sea exploration in general, it doesn't seem there's much of an investment compared to, say, NASA.
Yeah, you know, they're not the only other intelligent species, but they're given their clearly sophisticated language. There's been I think an understandable fascination with them, and yeah, the undersea world is still another. You know, space isn't the only final frontier, right?
Yeah.
So,
can you? Or did you want to get in?
Oh, well, I was also just wanted to say, right, we still haven't fully figured out how to get along with the creatures that we're sharing this planet on, right? But we have driven so many species into extinction, or to a point very close to extinction. We have sort of often only figured out, well, how we can keep certain species in a way that they are not a threat to us, but while we still sort of want to be the dominant species on this planet, and I think this is sort of maybe not a healthy sort of attitude for going out into this universe, right?
But there is a counter narrative there. While we're on the subject of whales, which is that obviously we did way too much whaling and drove a lot of whales to extinction or near extinction, and that's tragic and regrettable. But there's been a successful effort to save whales in recent decades, and a lot of whale species are coming back. And that's not driven by any economic incentive, or it's driven by altruism, and it's been successful. So in the story of whales, there's also a story of a different part of our nature that has been successful, and I think that's worth pointing out because we've done regrettable things on this planet, and we're still doing regrettable things. But we are arguably the only species that's ever attempted to stop another species from going extinct, and succeeded at that. So we have this. We're complex, you know.
There's a lot of. I think there's a lot of optimism that we should have when looking at the human species. So.
And I think also Islam it teaches an idea of stewardship. Right, that we as humans, right, we have a responsibility to take care of other creatures on this planet. Yeah. Yes, we have maybe a special status, but that special status is connected to us being sort of stewards of other forms of creation on this planet.
You should come to Istanbul and look at the cats and how they how they live. They have like thousands and thousands of cats taken care of by and this is like a religious kind of inheritance from the Ottoman period, and so yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, absolutely right. That humans, we have this incredible capacity for altruism, right? That we can be there for other creatures. Not for any economic reason, but just because we want to help them, and that altruism is also very, very important in many, many religious traditions, including Islam.
Yeah, it's mercy. Like you see something in need, you want to take care of it. It's in Jesus's teachings and all of the prophets and messengers.
David, I'm wondering if there have been discussions or projects in NASA to determine a plan on how you would message out to the world if extraterrestrial life or non-human intelligence was discovered. Can you talk a bit about your work at NASA on that?
Yeah, so we've done a lot at NASA in thinking about how to message on this topic. Not specifically about extraterrestrial intelligence, although that enters into the conversation, but now we are at this stage where we are searching the other places in our solar system and exoplanets for some sign of extraterrestrial life. And we've made some observations that may even be tentative, or at least, when they're first, when the data first comes in, there's a reason to think it's a possible, what we call a biosignature, potential biosignature. But it's subject to other interpretations as well. And so we've done a lot of thinking about how do you message about these possible biosignatures, because
Can you explain biosignature?
Sorry, yeah.
Be specific. What do you mean?
Sure. A biosignature is simply some evidence that suggests the existence of extraterrestrial life. And some examples would be if you find some mixture of gases in the atmosphere of an exoplanet, a planet around another star, that seems to require some biological process to create it. For instance, if you were an extraterrestrial observing Earth, you would see our atmosphere has all this oxygen and yet other compounds like methane in it, which doesn't make sense if there's not life. Our atmosphere is weird compared to any other atmosphere in our solar system, and it's weird because life is perturbing it. That's why all this oxygen is here, because of green plants. And
how could we observe that from so far away?
So we have instruments called spectrometers that we hook up to telescopes and analyze the frequencies of light very carefully, and you can break light up into thousands, millions of frequencies. And we know from laboratory experiments and from theory how to deduce what chemicals are in the source of that light. And that theory is very well known, and it's been very successful and verified. So we can, if we can get a spectrum of the atmosphere of, say, an exoplanet, we know what's in that atmosphere, and that works. I mean, and of course, in our own solar system, we can do better. We've gone to Mars and we've looked at rocks, and we found some rocks on Mars that actually have what we call potential biosignatures. There are strange patterns of chemicals. We wouldn't say we've definitely found evidence of ancient life on Mars, but we've found some rocks that seem to have chemistry that is hard to make without ancient life being the explanation. We'd like to examine those rocks more carefully. So we've had a lot of conversations about how you communicate those kinds of results, because the press, of course, wants to say NASA finds life. And whenever a scientist comes out with a paper that mentions a possible biosignature, then there's this tendency for, first of all, the press office of their own university wants them to have made a sensational discovery, so they'll try to sensationalize it. And then the journalists want to have clicks on their stories, so they'll sensationalize it. So if a scientist comes out with a statement and says, well, I found this chemical and it this observation of an exoplanet, and it's something that we need to study more, because one possible explanation is it could be biological. By the time that gets into the daily news, it's like life on Mars. And so,
but are they being too conservative, you think, because of fear of that control of the narrative, Nick?
Well, I think, there is this sort of, I'm all for having a plan, but I think it comes back to the point there are so many variables. You just instinctively feel that when the rubber hits the road, any plan is going to go out of the window, and the media is just going to say aliens or non-human intelligence or
but
whatever.
The problem we have with that is that then it becomes like the boy who cried wolf, where what's probably going to happen for the scientific community to come around to saying, yes, we've detected life, is there'll probably be years of observations. We found a potential biosignature, we make another prediction, we follow up, we observe it. If every potential biosignature, the headline says life found, then 20 years later, when you have really found it, then the public and the press says, oh, we heard about that years ago, and they discount it. So you sort of you can end up kind of discrediting the real discoveries.
And we've got a model for that, of course. 1996, the Martian meteorite. I mean, I was living in the UK at the time. The headlines in the paper said life on Mars. David Bowie's eponymous song got a lot of airplay, and then everyone just forgot it and moved on. So I think, like I say, you can have the plans, but the reality may unfold a different way. Matthias, you mentioned COVID. I think this gives us a very interesting model for something else. At the moment, you have a lot of conspiracy theorists who believe the government already knows this is true and is covering it up. I don't actually believe that.
Why?
Having
as someone who worked
for them,
in government, I would like to know.
I've seen no smoking gun myself. I think there's life out there. I hope there is, because the world would certainly be more interesting if there NHI, UAP than not. But I don't know it to be a fact. But
And yet you said that you do believe it exists.
I do believe it exists.
Like, what about your work made you get there?
Well, I think we had these things detected across multiple platforms. So it's not just the pilots seeing something, but it's corroboration on conventional radar systems, forward-looking infrared cameras, military satellites, and such. But my point about COVID was going to be, we're going to flip the narrative, because if the government or NASA or both basically say we've discovered extraterrestrial life, there'll be an awful lot of people who say, I don't believe you. It's fake news for some sort of narrative control purposes.
Absolutely. And you will always have rival politicians who will try to exploit whatever situation there is, just like, for instance, climate change is another example, right? We have within the scientific community really good evidence that anthropogenic human-made climate change is happening, and yet you have rival politicians and sort of journalists and a certain segment of the scientific community too, still arguing whether climate change is real for political reasons, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously won't be able to control the narrative, but we can still try, and I think we've actually made some progress. We had a series of workshops with scientists and with journalists at NASA, and to talk about this question of how do you communicate about this. And we did scenario projection and role playing, where we sort of played out different scenarios of different kinds of detections, and worked with journalists and sort of tried to come up with a sort of arc of how you describe this really journey of discovery that may take years and decades, and not just treat every possible detection as a discrete story in and of itself. And I would say we've had some effect. I mean, again, there's so much you can't control, especially these days with social media. But there was a story that came out last year about this rock called Shavaya Falls that we found on Mars. And we were very careful in our messaging about saying it's a potential biosignature, this, that, and the other thing. And we were gratified that the stories that came out in the press after that, they kind of got it right. I mean, not every outlet, but the New York Times, for instance, their headline said something like, NASA thinks it may have found a sign of life on Mars, but there are other explanations. And we were like, yes, that's exactly the way we want them to talk about it. So we'll never really be able to control the narrative, but I think it's still worthwhile trying to get it right.
Sheikh Hamza, if you had the choice, who would control the narrative? Who would announce that we've found, non-human intelligence or extraterrestrial intelligence? Would it be the journalists from the New York Times? Would it be the government of the US or the UK?
I'm not, I don't know, I haven't really thought about it that much. I guess it's, in general, the fact that people have such a hard time believing all of these announcements points to the fact that people aren't, most outlets aren't conveying information accurately. They're not fulfilling the trust that they have. Al Jazeera.
Well, it speaks to the question, the wider question, who speaks for planet Earth? And my answer to that is nobody does. Nobody, no politician, no national leader, no religious leader, no scientist can really claim to speak for everyone. And what about the billions of people who have no voice? So I mean, yes, you could say that if this actually happens, a lot of those people, politicians, religious leaders, scientists, will speak out immediately. There'll be a scramble to be first. There'll be a scramble for narrative control. Maybe you should say it is the fairest and most equitable thing that the person who makes the discovery should announce it. But in reality, everyone will probably go at once. But yeah, who speaks for planet Earth?
But do we need to have a game plan about that?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful.
By the way, the SETI community does have what they call a protocol for this, which say an observatory makes a detection that they think is actually a signal. What do? There actually is a plan, and the first thing they do, they don't announce it immediately. They contact other observers, other observatories, and they say, "Hey, could you look at this star. We think we've seen something, but
That's
they don't.
good.
They don't announce it to the world. They try to get
Yeah.
confirmation, and they try to make absolutely sure that what they're seeing is not some false, interference from Earth, some military signal or something, which has happened before. And then once they are convinced it's real, then you tell the world. I mean, that's the protocol. You tell everybody.
So SETI tells the world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it's detected by in the way we imagine, SETI imagines, then they tell the world.
And SETI is based where?
Well, okay. There's a group in California called the SETI Institute that's sometimes confused with the field of SETI. But SETI is a field of inquiry that's all over the world at many institutions. So it's not based in any one place.
Please.
Yeah, that's great. We do also have sort of international organizations that deal with controversial astronomical matters. In particular, the International Astronomical Union, the IAU, that has made controversial decisions before. 20 years ago, the demotion of Pluto from a planet to a dwarf planet. And at the time, this was hotly debated, and there was a lot of pushback from people of all ages, from all countries. But at the same time, the International Astronomical Community, they were able to reach more or less a consensus. They were able to make a statement that was largely accepted, that Pluto is no longer a planet like the rest of the planets. And to a certain extent, it works because the International Astronomical Union, it is not actually a political organization. It isn't a very powerful organization either. It isn't a very well-funded organization. But it is also then an organization where actually not a lot of other interests interfere. But my hope would be that it would be the International Astronomical Union that would take a lead on there. And it might not be a single statement. It might be a debate within the scientific community that over years congeals or solidifies into something, for instance, like we now have more or less a consensus on anthropogenic climate change.
It's funny you use that example because I think the Pluto debate was handled very badly by the IAU, and there are a lot of us, including myself, in the astronomical community that don't accept that definition of planet that they came up with, and the supposed demotion of Pluto. I think we don't have to get way into that, but I think it's an example of
No,
them
please,
being
you can get a little bit
pretty
into
sloppy.
it.
Well,
It's intriguing to me as an outsider,
Okay, so they
because this is kind of showing, there could be conflict over actually the messaging.
So in brief, they defined planet by its gravitational effect on other objects, not by its intrinsic properties. And the way they defined it is such that if you moved Earth out into the Kuiper belt where Pluto is, Earth would no longer be a planet because it wouldn't have cleared its zone. So it's not a shining example.
We won't go down that rabbit hole, but the point is that you don't agree with how the decision they made.
Yeah,
so how does that relate to
there are a lot of people in the community that don't agree. So I guess the way
would we unite? You said maybe humanity would unite.
The way it relates is that there's no simple and in fact the SETI protocols that I mentioned have been subject to a lot of debate. And of course, debate is healthy. There's a debate happening now about a second protocol, which is not, there's agreement roughly on if we detect something that we tell the world. But the debate now is, should we be sending out messages? It's called the METI debate, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. And there's a lot of disagreement about that. People are trying to come up with a new protocol, but there's an argument that, well, if we're listening, we should be sending. It's only fair. There's another argument that says, hold on, we can't speak for Earth, and we don't know 100% that it's safe, because what if we did trigger something that got the attention of...
Is there anyone at this table that is fearful of sending messages out into the universe?
I'm not. I mean, I take the view, and correct me on the science, please, but we have been a detectable civilization for decades through our radio broadcasts, some other leakages from certain radar systems and things, and maybe even some of our satellites, if somebody out there has James Webb plus 10 or something. So I don't think you can get the toothpaste back in the tube on that.
That's kind of true, that we haven't been completely silent and completely invisible. But it's also true that if we were to send out very powerful messages right at stars that might be habitable, we would drastically change how visible we are. So that argument that sort of the horse has left the barn is not quite accurate in reference to this debate, because we could make ourselves much more noticeable and much more visible if we chose to message. But having said that, I personally am not fearful. I don't think you can kind of live in fear of the rest of the universe.
I would agree with that. I would also say that we cannot not communicate, right? Because even a lack of communication could be interpreted as a kind of communication. So imagine we had a spacecraft entering the solar system. Even if they were not sending out any radio messages or any light signals, just their presence itself could be interpreted. And sometimes, right, if you're not communicating at all, it can actually sort of make you appear even more suspicious, or potentially even more threatening, compared to if you are sort of very open and you're trying to sort of share as much as you can.
Nick, I'm wondering, is it possible, are these discussions happening in government, like in the US and the UK, that they're already here, that they're already on Earth? Extraterrestrials came and they're already present with us?
I mean, I can't rule it out, but I've seen no evidence for it.
But it goes back to my first question to you at the start of this, which is the phrase non-human intelligence. Can you just go a bit deeper into that? Because I'm just wondering, have you heard that conversation? Has it, even in the testimonies you mentioned, that they could already be on Earth?
I mean, you do hear people make the claims,
but the government, the UK and the US governments aren't investigating that?
Not to my knowledge, no. That goes, I think, too far. That does segue into something that's more science fiction and conspiracy than actual science.
Speaking of science fiction, yeah, please.
Maybe to add to that as well, right? You mentioned governments as well. And yes, politicians, including members of Congress, they're talking and they're debating. And I also agree with David's point about scientists are trying to be very cautious. At the same time, it is actually very hard for a lot of scientists to keep secrets. So if people at NASA had detected and had really found evidence of extraterrestrial life, I don't think NASA scientists...
It's impossible to keep. Nobody would want to keep it secret.
Exactly.
And if they wanted to, they wouldn't be able to. We used to joke when I was a postdoc at a NASA research center, and there were some stories out there about, NASA's detected extraterrestrial life, but they're keeping it secret. We talked about, hey, if the boss came by and said, hey, we found this thing, but you've got to keep it hush hush. I used to joke with my friends, how long do you think that would remain secret? And the answer was, how long would it take to type it and hit send? There's no way anybody would have any motivation or would obey any command or any ability to keep a secret like that.
And yet, haven't governments kept certain facts secret that would have been called conspiracy a decade ago that have been recognized? Like, for instance, UFOs, UAPs.
Yeah, governments can and do keep secrets all the time. I mean, I think there is a distinction between the civilian scientific community and the world of government.
What I just described is the mindset and ability of the civilian scientific community, not the military.
No, and I agree with you absolutely on that. Now, if government acquired this information first, I think, the extent to which a secret leaks depends on a number of variables, the number of people who are privy to it, but also the penalties, imprisonment, for example, that could come from disclosing classified information. And to give a couple of historical examples, I mean, thousands of people were working on the Manhattan Project. It didn't actually leak out until the bomb was dropped. The breaking of the German codes during the Second World War, a lot of people have the misconception that that was immediately the war ended out in the open. It wasn't. It was the late 60s before, for example, the breaking of the Enigma codes was actually made public. So governments can and do keep secrets.
So the government isn't really searching for. It seems to me it's not searching for intelligent extraterrestrial life. It's just trying to protect against attack by a foreign country. Isn't that? Is that right? Or
I think so, yes. I mean, in the United States right now, there is an office in the Pentagon called AARO, All Domain Anomalous Research Organization, which manages the UAP subject. But that's really more about, producing reports in response to congressional inquiries than it is about actively searching for UAP, NHI, whatever terminology we want to use. I mean,
that's a new one. What's NHI?
Non-human intelligence again.
Thank you.
But the active search for extraterrestrial intelligence or non-human intelligence, that's much more of a scientific thing.
So when you say the government isn't searching, the military part of the government, the government also funds us, astrobiology and SETI, to some degree, mostly astrobiology. SETI's more privately funded, actually. But
can you explain astrobiology?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
just really quick.
No problem. Astrobiology is basically the scientific study of life in the universe, which of course, a lot of it is geared towards trying to search for extraterrestrial life. But in fact, astrobiology funds a lot of research on Earth, studying what we call extremophiles, extreme life on Earth, and trying to understand the patterns and evolution of life on Earth so that we can be more sophisticated in understanding how we might find life elsewhere. So a lot of it is directed at sort of contextualizing terrestrial life and how it interacts with its environment so we can search elsewhere. But that's what astrobiology is.
Okay, so the government funds that as well, you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, we're not as well funded as the military, let's face it. But so there is a government-funded effort to find extraterrestrial life, including for a long time in the U.S., there was a prohibition on the government funding SETI, this extraterrestrial intelligence, so it was just non-intelligent life. And there's some interesting political background behind that, but that's changed in the last few years, and now NASA is allowed to fund technosignature searches, and so there's some resources being put into looking for intelligent life as well.
I want to hear about technosignatures because I've heard it a few times today, but is what you're talking about including Mars? Because you mentioned Mars earlier, so what's the fascination with Mars?
So there are not currently technosignature searches on Mars, but there are definitely biosignature searches, and it's mostly.
What's the difference? Sorry.
No, so that's fine.
I need you to be specific, please.
Of course, I'm sorry.
No.
Biosignatures are a biosignature would be evidence that's consistent with biology in some other part of the universe. A technosignature it is evidence of technology elsewhere. And it's changed a little bit from SETI because SETI was focused more on finding messages. And the idea of technosignatures is it doesn't have to be a message. They may not be trying to communicate with us or know anything about other life. It's just simply detecting the use of technology somewhere. So it's sort of broader. A signal would be a technosignature, but a technosignature doesn't have to be a signal, if that makes sense.
Which you're not looking for on Mars.
Right, because we know enough about Mars now to pretty much rule out there being technology and civilization there. And the possibility of even current life on Mars, it's possible that there's something underground, but the surface of Mars we know to be pretty hostile to life as we know it. But the main focus of our investigation of Mars is looking for signs of past life because we've discovered enough about Mars to know that in the past it was much more Earth-like. There was liquid water. It was a habitable planet at the time when life was new on Earth. And so given what we've learned about what we think we know about the origin of life on Earth, there should have been an origin of life on Mars. And if there wasn't, that's a really interesting finding too, because it means there's something more unique about Earth than we understand right now.
Why? Why should there have been that at Mars?
What we think what we've concluded about the origin of life, and I have to say this with the humility and the caveat that we don't fully understand the origin of life, but what we think is that it required liquid water, it required organic molecules, and some kind of energy source. And we know enough about ancient Mars to know that, in fact, it had copious liquid water that's not there on the surface anymore, but we see dried up riverbeds, we see dried up lakes, and we know there were sources of organic matter. And we know that Mars had a thicker, more protective atmosphere. So the conditions on early Mars seem to be similar to the conditions on early Earth that we think led to an origin of life. So there should have been an origin of life on Mars unless we're missing something. So we very much want to go and look for ancient life on Mars because finding it would be incredible, and ruling it out would also be really interesting and tell us something also about ourselves.
I think that's really interesting, like by what you said about ruling out life there. So if we have like a dozen examples of places where life could exist and they're ruled out, would that support the idea that maybe we are the only intelligent beings in the universe?
I think it would support it, but we have to add the caveat that it's very hard to prove a negative.
Yeah,
like, could you ever prove for sure that there's no life on Mars? Probably not, because maybe we're missing it, looking in the wrong place, looking in the wrong way. But nonetheless, if we explore Mars very thoroughly and find no evidence that there ever was any kind of early organic evolution preserved anywhere on the planet, then we start to move towards a worldview that there's something about Earth that doesn't necessarily mean that we're completely alone in the universe, but that we don't understand that was required for the origin of life. And in the long run, if we search many places like that and we never find any evidence that life ever got started anywhere else, then it does slowly, and this might take centuries, but it moves us towards a worldview that maybe we really are more unique than scientists currently think we probably are.
So what would that mean to you? Like what if we were alone in the universe? Then what is that? I'm just interested. How do you process that?
I personally, first of all, I know I won't live to have that knowledge, because I think, as I said, it would probably take at least centuries to really be able to reach that conclusion. But so it's hard for me to sort of project myself to, because it's not something I know I'll have to contend with. But I suppose it would lead me to a different worldview where there's something really unique and precious. I already feel like there's something unique and precious about Earth, but not in that sense of complex life only existing here. And there's been this sort of trend in science. You mentioned Copernicanism, this idea that the more we learn about the universe, the less special our location seems and the less special Earth seems. And in some sense, maybe the less special we seem, although we're not anywhere near that because, of course, we haven't found extraterrestrial life yet. But I think that it would very much reverse that view, right? That philosophical view. I think it would, if somehow I was presented with that knowledge in a certain way, it would probably lead me to really kind of question my sort of philosophical stance on a lot of things.
I'd be rather sad and disappointed myself, because I think the universe would be certainly more interesting and possibly even more fun with extraterrestrials, other intelligences.
Yeah, it would also sort of make the question of the origin of life on Earth even more important, right? If life on this planet is truly the only one in the universe, how did it in fact come about, right? How was there a religious origin story that where God or some other kind of like supernatural being, supernatural intelligence at some point started life on Earth. If we are truly the only place where life could ever start in the universe, amidst all the planets in the universe, in all those galaxies.
Yeah, it really kind of reverses all kinds of assumptions that we've had, certainly since the Copernican revolution. And I think maybe, I don't know, it might be very good for kind of recruitment of people with a naturalistic worldview to more your worldview would be like, well, maybe they're right.
Well, yeah. So I actually, yeah,
Can you answer your own question? Would it
yeah.
change
So first
your?
of all, so I don't actually think that it's that we need to see that we're alone in the universe in order to prove that there is a supernatural origin, at least to human beings. So human beings, I think that based on revelatory evidence that there is, I believe that that we are a special and unique creation that was in heaven, that was sent down to earth. But if we were alone in the universe, meaning that there is no other extraterrestrial life, then I think nothing would change. We would be where we were like 200 years ago, and it wouldn't really there wouldn't be a need for this conversation. But I think that it fits with the way that Muslims, Christians have.
I think it was Carl Sagan who said it would be an awfully large waste of space.
I wonder though what.
That would be, it would be an awfully large waste of space. Well, if I don't agree with that, because it would just be something that would be pointing to a very cosmic significance that we have as human beings. So that huge expanse of space would have a cosmic purpose, but if it would only be a waste of space if you're looking at it from like a utilitarian perspective,
But my I confess to having a pretty naturalistic view of the universe, but to me, that doesn't make me feel disconnected from the rest of the universe, because part of my sort of understanding of cosmic evolution is that, the Earth wouldn't be here without the birth and deaths of many stars. And, it's been said we are stardust, we are star stuff, which Harlow Shapley said, and then Carl Sagan copped from him. But anyways, that we are star stuff. And whether or not there's anyone out there, the more we understand about our deep origins and our nature, we are connected with the rest of the universe. But I also agree to a sense of sort of that it would be disappointing, because the idea that just as the biodiversity on Earth is thrilling, and even on Earth discovering other creatures and other places and all that just amazing evolution that's occurred, and then just the diversity, thinking of that whole universe and of possibility out there, I confess to wanting there to be life, and just the richness of evolution filling all those spaces. To me, that's a more exciting and kind of fulfilling vision of the universe than a universe where this is only happening on Earth.
And we may have an interesting dry run for this. I mean, I think you mentioned, Matthias, earlier, artificial intelligence, and it's come up a couple of times. And I think, it plays into the debate, which I think several of us have mentioned, about how do you define, intelligence? Is it anything to do with technology? Is there a moral or spiritual aspect to this? But pretty soon we're going to have this debate about artificial intelligence. Some of us are having that debate already. Is it sentient? Is it about to become sentient? How could we ever know? Or is it just mimicking sentience? Some people already in some legal jurisdictions give personhood rights to some of the great apes, I believe. There will be a debate about whether we give personhood rights to AI at some stage. And this is going to be an interesting, I say dry run because this is happening now. The discovery of a non-human intelligence may take a little bit more time. So it's going to be an interesting practical demonstration of how we might, as humans, have this conversation.
And if we're so afraid of other intelligences, then why are we creating it?
Well, some people do want to pull the plug,
right.
or at least pause.
That's right.
I thought it was interesting, Sheikh Hamza, earlier when you referenced, well, maybe the aliens have already self-destructed. I mean, were you referring to AI? What did you mean by that?
I think. Well, I was just speaking to David's perspective on advanced technology is it makes us more powerful, and the more powerful we are, the more ability we have to inflict either harm or good. But the nature of desire for power, desire for money, desire for influence is that whenever somebody has a huge amount of power, they will use it normally for to destroy things, for some kind of selfish gain. I guess that's where David was coming from. So I was just kind of elaborating on his thing, that playing along with his reasoning, that if they have survived, then they're wiser and more intelligent than us. But I was just highlighting that it's an if.
Sure.
It's
I mean,
an if.
societies
It's an
face a
if.
number of
So
existential threats. I mean,
might be like a.
Elon Musk talks about how we currently have all our eggs in one basket here on Earth. One big comet or asteroid strike, one devastating global pandemic, one nuclear war could wipe us out, or at least set us back millennia.
Yeah. And
Well, I mean, just following up on what you said, I mean, so there has been an argument made, and in fact, Carl Sagan was a big proponent of this, and I confess to have been very influenced by Carl Sagan, that this question we were discussing earlier of whether technological advancement would inevitably have to be accompanied by sort of moral or social advancement. And his claim was that it does have to be, because of just what you're saying, that the civilizations that developed, say, nuclear weapons but were still moral infants would inevitably wipe themselves out. And therefore, there's sort of a natural selection that the civilizations we would encounter that had powerful technology would not be warlike and have that sort of, if we can use that word, primitive tendency to just be territorial and sort of violent with other creatures, because they would not last.
But that still assumes that they survive. It's assuming whether or not they survive is still an assumption. So it's still an if. So that was, maybe they've all destroyed themselves.
It's not an ironclad argument.
I want to get Matthias.
Thank you so much. And it is also possible that the biological parts of that civilization go extinct and the technological ones survive. So, Nick, you mentioned the example of an asteroid hitting Earth, right? If a big enough asteroid would hit Earth, could possibly destroy all human life on it, and all remnants of our civilization would be the robotic spacecraft that we have sent elsewhere in the solar system and beyond. It would be all the robots that we have on Mars currently, and Mars is the only planet that we know of that is entirely inhabited by robots so far.
But Earth is not currently vulnerable to that. Earth, 100 years ago, Earth was still under threat by an asteroid strike. We are no longer under threat by an asteroid strike because we have a space program and we have telescopes, and we could detect an asteroid decades out that was going, and we could do something about it. So that's actually a significant change in the evolution of the planet that has come about by our civilization. Now, if we can keep our civilization, if you can keep it, that we should be able to prevent that threat from ever from ever striking Earth again, which wasn't true until very recently. So,
are we potentially dangerous to them?
Potentially, absolutely. I mean, we are dangerous, potentially dangerous to all life forms on our planet here. So we could also be potentially dangerous to life form elsewhere, whether consciously or unconsciously so, right? So if we decide to not only send sanitized robots to Mars, but if we actually send humans that cannot be completely sanitized, we're not just sending ourselves, we're sending all the microbes, all the bacteria and viruses that live in us and on us. And even if we don't want to hurt any life forms on Mars, but just the microbes, the viruses, the bacteria that we bring with us could potentially have a devastating effect on life elsewhere, just as, for instance, germs that we've brought to other parts of the world in the history of colonial expansion, imperialism, was devastating.
I mean, it's worth pointing out we have something called planetary protection, which is that as we explore the rest of the solar system, we've been very careful there's been an effort, there are rules and laws and international agreements that we do everything we can to prevent contaminating other places.
Okay.
Not that we couldn't accidentally, and especially when we send humans, it's going to be harder to do that. But I think it's worth pointing out that we have not been oblivious as we explore the solar system. I would say we've been very responsible, maybe more than we need to be, because it's very unlikely that we probably could harm another biosphere accidentally, because that presupposes that our germs could be compatible with them enough to hurt them. Mm-hmm. But we've actually put a lot of care, and it's much more expensive to explore the solar system that way because you have to clean your spacecraft and do all kinds of extraordinary efforts. But so we've done that. So there's been sort of an ethical component to our exploration so far.
For the scientific community, but I'm wondering from where you've sat.
Whether humanity could be dangerous to other civilizations. Well, we might, if we encounter other civilizations, there might be ideas that humans have, belief systems, philosophies that are not currently ones that have taken hold in those other civilizations, but which might be very seductive, might take hold, and might do them some harm. There's something, I don't know what it might be, but something to us quite innocuous that they look at us and say, hey, let's do that. And suddenly they're on a path to destruction.
Aren't there already? Yeah, please.
I would also agree with, both of you, but also with David, that yes, on the whole, we, as in the scientific community, we have been sort of very careful, let's say, to sanitize any spacecraft, any robots that we send to Mars, for example. But not everybody in the space business has been as responsible as the scientific community would
you
like.
Use the word business.
Exactly. So famously, Elon Musk sent a Tesla car into the solar system, into an orbit around the sun. And I don't think that Tesla car was as sanitized as, let's say, a NASA spacecraft. And of course...
But it wasn't going anywhere.
It wasn't going anywhere.
Let me give an example.
But the orbit might still change of that object. It is still possible that Tesla spacecraft could still crash into Mars at some point.
He wouldn't like that because doesn't he want to colonize Mars? Isn't that on the table?
Let me circle back and answer again. You give a practical answer to your last question about another way that we might be a threat. And I talked about ideas taking hold. And I know the problem with all of this is that we can only look at this in an anthropocentric point of view. So a lot of this is assumption. But let's suppose there are other civilizations out there that have figured out nuclear power. But just in terms of their mindset, they've never thought to make a weapon out of it. But they look and they see what they're doing and say, hey, you can't only run power stations, you can make a big bomb.
Yeah. And there's also something that doesn't need to be designed as a weapon that can be incredibly damaging. We see this right now with the problem of space debris, with sort of increasingly too many objects in Earth orbits, right? With satellite constellations owned by Starlink, sort of other space companies, and most of the satellites that we have out there are not sort of weapons in any conventional sense, but they are objects that move at incredibly high speed around the Earth and then can crash into one another and produce thousands of little bits that, again, move at incredibly high speed. So...
That's a potential threat to ourselves. It's hard to imagine how that would be a threat to extraterrestrials. But
here's a scenario, though. Let's suppose that we were visited by another civilization, and they come here and we don't give them sort of godlike qualities. We figure that if they get here, yes, sure, they're probably more advanced, but not infinitely so. And they come here and their craft gets impacted by a lot of our debris, and then they say to themselves, hey, this planet's got a kind of defensive shield, and they've just wiped out. We were coming here to do a peaceful first contact, and they've just destroyed our ship because they've got all these particles orbiting at high speed, and they've just ripped us up.
That's
David, I'm wondering, in the scientific community, are there ethical considerations to perhaps opening this kind of exploration up to special interests? I mean, how quickly does fascination with a potential discovery become opportunity for nefarious actors?
Yeah, well, I would say in the scientific community, there's a lot of concern and pretty widespread, maybe not universal, sort of ethical standard that let's not mess up other planets. Certainly the more pragmatic reason is let's not do it, at least until we've had a chance to study them. Like, the planetary protection that I mentioned, there's sort of two components of that. One is ethical. It's not, you don't want to just sort of wipe out another biosphere inadvertently. But admittedly, there's also just the curiosity factor. That would mess up our science. We don't want to go to Mars and accidentally discover microbes that we took there ourselves, right? So that's the general presumption. It does get more complicated if we discovered, say, something valuable that could be mined, or I don't think we're in danger of that immediately. We know that some asteroids have a lot of valuable minerals, but the idea that you could go through the expense of mining them and then bring them back to Earth, and then it would be worth that, is pretty far-fetched. So people talk more about mining asteroids to develop a space economy. They would be useful if there were things you needed them for in space, but the only way to do that is to sort of create this economy out there that doesn't exist. There are people that very much want to do that, and that's where there's some interesting sort of ethical disagreement, because I think there are definitely people within the scientific community that will say, no, let's not mine asteroids or mine the moon, because those places have intrinsic worth and they shouldn't be screwed up, even if there's nobody living there, because of sort of intrinsic value. And there are others who feel like, well, if nobody's living there, it's just a pile of rocks. Let's mine it. Who cares? So there are. It's actually, there are different gradations. I think if there's a potential biosphere, then there's pretty much universal agreement that, like, hey, let's tread lightly there.
What about colonization? If there is someone there?
Yeah, it's funny. That's a really loaded word because of the history of that word. So I tend to personally shy away from it and talk about settlement. Although I understand that, if you're talking about a place,
a bit. No?
If you're talking about a place where nobody's ever lived, then it's not really analogous to not just no humans, but no any creature. It's not really analogous to colonization on Earth and the history of that. But
are there
leaving
discussions
semantics
taking
aside,
place? People stand
yes,
on
yes. I'd say there's not a universal stance on that within the scientific community. It's everything from look at how one extreme is look at what we've done on Earth. We obviously don't have the moral fiber. Let's just leave those places alone because otherwise we'll just screw them up. And then the other extreme end of that is through moving into the solar system and creating new spaces for civilization, we can actually help humanity advance morally and sort of become the responsible, long-lived creatures we want to be. And, I think between those two extremes, there's a whole gradation of belief.
Sheikh Hamza, what are the most plausible, unexplainable phenomenon that intrigue you the most, that interest you the most?
I guess I'm intrigued by the unexplained aspects of UFO sightings, and I think that that is I'm a little bit I wouldn't want to actually study it myself because I'm apprehensive about studying that realm of existence, but it is
Why?
something. Jinn, I think it's the jinn are creatures that there's believers among them and there's disbelievers among them.
So you're
And,
convinced it's jinn?
I have I would have to look at it more carefully to reach a conclusive decision, but it looks like that from a distance, and that means that so normally it's associated. It's normally associated with some kind of demonic practice, some unethical, to say the least, human activity around it. It can be harmful, it can be damaging, and the way to combat it is not through some kind of like a natural technological solution, but the way to combat it would be through prayers and through recitation of the Quran, things like that. So,
What qualities point to it from your perspective being demonic? What are the qualities?
well, so there
Because you
are
mentioned, the recognition of the potentiality of demonic forces as well, which I found interesting. So
when the presence of jinn is associated with anxiety, worry. It's associated with there's abductions that can also happen. There's often repeat phenomena. So I read, I'm interested in asking whether or not that's true, but that people who see it once they feel like it might happen again to them. They feel like they're being watched. There's reports of things like this. All of that, and I think just a general unethical conduct of people in military and government all over the world doesn't seem like a very ethical place to be. So the convergence of all of those factors.
And I've seen
leads me
those
to-
concerns articulated certainly in the British government, or parts of it, certainly as a minority report, should we say. And some of the whistleblowers with verifiable backgrounds in UAP and in the United States have talked about it too. And they've talked about, one whistleblower, Luis Elizondo, told an account of how he was trying to get more resources put into UAP research, and he was told no, by someone at a more senior level, well, I don't agree with this because some of these may be unclean spirits, demons, and you shouldn't engage with them because that feeds them and gives them energy. Now, you find this across a spread of different religions, and you find it in a secular world too. I mean, almost every society in human history has had some sort of other entities, and whether we call them jinn or demons or angels or dwarves, elves, fairies, goblins, the culture of this other intelligence interacting with us, and the idea that sometimes they are at best perhaps mischievous or deceivers, at worst maybe malevolent, is something that's remarkably cross-cultural.
And I'm wondering your thoughts on the question I asked Sheikh Hamza, which is, what are the most plausible unexplained phenomena that interest you the most?
The ones that interest me most are I suppose, UAP data that might indicate, though it's open to interpretation, things like speeds, maneuvers, and accelerations that seem to go beyond the cutting edge of our own aerospace technology. Now, is that a sensor error? Is that something else, like some parallax effect or something, or is it genuine data? I don't know. But of course, some of the whistleblowers have gone much further than that. Some of the whistleblowers have alleged that there are still classified programs somewhere in the US, maybe intelligence community, but perhaps in the private sector, that actually have hardware, crashed, ships. Well, I don't know that that's true, but if it is true, let's try to find out, because that would be paradigm changing.
What about you?
Well, it would be paradigm changing, but I'm highly skeptical of that because there's never been any evidence produced. Some of this stuff supposedly goes back decades, and the rationale for why you would keep it so secret just doesn't add up. Give us some of that stuff to look at in the laboratory, and we could tell you if it comes from Earth very easily or not. And there's a history, a verified history of the military community spreading false stories about alien technology in order to cover up classified stuff they were doing that was military technology. The famous Roswell incident, where it turns out something did crash. And then the press started telling stories about this is Roswell, New Mexico, 1947?
47, yeah.
And the press started spreading stories about, this farmer found something that, maybe it was aliens. And the military knew that it wasn't. They knew what it was, that it was some Cold War secret technology that had crashed. But it was convenient for them to say, let's let this alien story spread. And there are other examples
Convenient
also.
Just to cover their track.
Yeah, exactly. And there were other examples more recent from the 1980s of sightings. Turned out a lot of the UFO sightings in the 1980s were classified military aircraft. And again, it was sort of convenient for them to let these stories spread. So
and interestingly, right, we are now in a similar moment in time as perhaps we were in the 1940s, also in the 1980s, right? We are in a new Cold War at the moment, right? We are again sort of having the world being divided into different powers that seem to be competing with one another. But this is a time, just like in the 1940s and 1950s, right, where you had like the dawn of the space age, where you just had a lot more new objects in the sky. Back in the 1940s and 50s, it was rockets, and then was the first satellite, Sputnik, where, of course, governments were very, very interested in looking at the sky, seeing, tracking rockets, tracking satellites, and sometimes also encouraging the public to share observations, right? Has anybody seen a Russian satellite or something that anomalous in the sky? Now, obviously, right, we are at a time where we have an increasing number of satellites in Earth orbit, where we have an increasing number of drones, and we have weather balloons too, like for instance those Chinese weather balloons that can produce a lot of paranoia, right? So we are sort of at a similar moment in time where sort of
But unlike then, now there are literally billions of cell phones with really sophisticated cameras all around the world, and there are amateur astronomers with really sophisticated equipment all around the world. And so it would be much harder for something to go unnoticed by the public. And yet, where's the evidence?
I hear your skepticism, but what are the most plausible unexplained phenomena that you are most interested in? The same question.
All right, good question. So when I was on this NASA UAP independent committee, we, for instance, we talked to a couple of pilots. There's a famous incident, the Tic Tac incident, which was a aircraft group off of San Diego. And you probably know the dates better than I.
2004, I think that one was.
That's in the early 2000s. They saw something. It's called the Tic Tac because of like the little snack thing that was shaped like a big Tic Tac, moving in an unusual way. Multiple pilots saw this. I've spoken to one of the pilots. I don't think that she made this up. She was very convinced she had seen it. She didn't know what she had seen. I think it was good faith reporting, and I have no idea what she saw. And to me, it's very mysterious. It doesn't say aliens because I don't have any reason to think, that I would need more to know that. But I do think from that and other. Again, it's frustrating because there's no data. In fact, they had some data that was not kept because their commander said, well, it's not related to our mission, whatever this thing is. And so one of the recommendations that our NASA panel made was keep all the data no matter what and collect better data. So
Sorry, that's just fodder for conspiracy theorists, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why? Why wouldn't he keep the data? Why would he order them to get rid of the data.
The mindset was very much, this isn't part of your mission, whatever that was. I know it's frustrating, but
I mean, how did your friend feel about that?
I think she was frustrated by it.
But was did she find it suspicious?
She didn't describe it in a way that was suspicious. She said that was the protocol. Remember, this
to
was
remove
in
the data.
This was in the date when this was, this was not just like a thumb drive. These were like tapes that had to be stored somewhere, and
Sure.
I
They
can't
didn't have the closet space.
I can't defend this because I think it sounds really stupid to me.
Well, I can give a
Yeah,
practical
I'm not
example.
trying to stir it, but it does sound suspicious to me.
Yeah,
To
I
be
can
honest,
give
as
I can give
layman.
a practical example of this. Back when I was doing UAP in the 90s, we literally downloaded radar data onto VHS video cassettes. We kept them for about a month, and then just because we didn't want tens of thousands of tapes, we reused them, and so within a month the data
Taped
was
over.
gone. But the wider problem, here is that previously, when we've acquired information about UAP, it's been what I would call accidental detection, because the sensor platforms that detect these things are not designed to detect UAP. They're designed to detect for foreign military aircraft, for example. And that's one of the reasons why Congress has said, well, go out and get some meaningful data rather than this sort of accidental leakage.
Right. And we very much recommended the same thing. And we also talked to a lot of commercial pilots. And there is a stigma where commercial pilots that have seen things they can't explain are encouraged not to report it because they don't want people to think they're nuts and get grounded. And so, again, it's anecdotal and it's a handful of reports and they're not consistent and it doesn't make a lot of sense. But it seems to me that, there's still a lot about our world that isn't well observed and that we don't understand. And there are examples of natural phenomena that were on our planet that were only discovered recently. Like there are these things called sprites, which are these high altitude lightning displays, which were reported anecdotally and discounted. And now they're observed better, and it turns out they exist. So I certainly think there are phenomena in our atmosphere that have been observed sparsely and are not well understood. There's a lot of historical examples of things that were considered to be just false reports and then turned out to be real. Meteorites. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "I would sooner believe two Yankee professors would lie than that rocks would fall from the sky." When these two Yale professors reported that that they had found evidence that meteorites came from the sky. Well, Thomas Jefferson was wrong. Rocks do fall from the sky, and these Yankee professors weren't lying. So I think that there's no reason to believe that we've cataloged everything that can be observed in Earth's atmosphere.
And then we also in certain instances, we don't have enough data, but we also have so much data that we haven't sufficiently analyzed, right? So, for instance, we have over 100 years worth of photographic plates that were sort of the main storage device for astronomical images. And over the last 20 years, a lot of these hundreds of thousands of photographic plates that would show the sky, that would show the stars, celestial objects of all kinds. They have been scanned, but still we have nowhere nearly exhaustively analyzed them. So there might still be, like you mentioned, sprites, so there might still be phenomena in our atmosphere that we have actually recorded that might be saved in a photographic plate or in an old VHS tape that still exists, but that we haven't been able to analyze properly or detect the patterns yet that one could detect later on.
Could AI help us with that?
Yes.
Is there hope
Absolutely.
that now,
this
with the
is
age
one
of AI,
this is one of the
LLMs?
promises of not just AI, but what we call big data. Machine learning, which is related to AI, but not quite the same thing. That you could, potentially feed all, the ones that haven't been destroyed, all these VHS tapes and all these old photographic plates, and have the machines go at it and look for patterns. And then, of course, the humans are going to have to like find out if it's real or they're hallucinating or finding something spurious. But there are potentially new tools that could really help us like do that search in a much more comprehensive way.
Sheikh Hamza, bringing us back to the original question, if we were to discover non-human intelligence, extraterrestrial beings, do you think it would humble us, or would it completely shake our sense of self?
So, speaking for myself, like I think that so if it humbles us, if the discovery of intelligent extraterrestrial life humbles us, then that means that before we discovered intelligent extraterrestrial life, we thought a lot about ourselves, right? So to be humbled by the discovery in that way is not, I don't think it paints a good picture of how we're supposed to be. So our humility comes from seeing our own shortcomings and humbling ourselves before God. So the discovery of intelligent extraterrestrial life, would it humble me? Would it humble us from this perspective? Perhaps. I guess it would show the majesty of God, that He's created. He has that the magnificence of His creation extends beyond this earth into the universe, which is like my equivalent of what David is hoping to see, all over the universe. So I think I don't think it would be related to.
I would agree with that. Depends on your own sort of attitude, your own personality. If you are used to thinking you're first, you're leading, then seeing somebody else who is first, who is leading, maybe who is more advanced, let's say, a civilization that maybe have conquered death, for instance, or where you have incredibly long lifespan and elimination of disease, poverty, and so on. So if you're used to you thinking that you're first, and then somebody else is ahead of you, that humbles you. But maybe we are just here talking about a small fraction of the human population who think they're first, right? In the United States of America, there is a lot of like worry, sometimes panic about losing American leadership to China, right? That China could be somehow first and America would be left behind. For a lot of people in other countries in the world, it's not that big of a deal whether it's America that's first or whether it's China it's first. I mean, they're kind of used to sort of another country sort of being ahead of them in some way. So if you are yourself sort of maybe more conscious of your own, I don't know, mediocrity in the sense of you're sort of just somewhere in the middle, then it's less of a shock to know that, okay, somebody else is ahead of you.
But for those with deep nationalism, like a country like the U.S., among large populations, do you think it would change that? How would it impact nationalism?
That's a good point, right? So yes, some people in the United States are deeply worried about China being ahead in some area of life, right? Whether it's ahead in science or ahead in technology or ahead in military. If you then had sort of another power that would be even more ahead of you, that could be sort of worrying, if not shocking.
Well, I hope that if we discover intelligent extraterrestrial life, or a non-human intelligence, should I say, that it would teach us to be a little bit more humble, to take a broader perspective. It might, and I know this is very kind of cliched and soundbitey, but it might teach us that as humans, there is more that binds us together than sets us apart. And I think, again, it takes us back to this question about the intersectionality between intelligence, technology, and thing. And one thing, and altruism, one thing I'd like to mention is curiosity. And I think my personal feeling about this is I'm not necessarily always a believer in human exceptionalism, but one of the things that I do like is the idea that we're curious, that we climb a mountain to see what's on the other side. It's not always just about resources or finding a mate or killing an enemy. It's about wanting to know what's out there. And I want to turn that around, because if we are, if we do discover an extraterrestrial civilization or they discover us, I like to think and hope that they would be driven by the same motives, by curiosity, that they come here as explorers and scientists, because I hope that's what we'd do if the situation was reversed.
I think there's argument to be made. There's reason to believe they would be. I mean, that curiosity has adaptive value, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking in terms of evolution, that's why we have science and probably religion and other developments, because we want to understand the world, and that's partly why we've been successful as a species. And presumably, somebody on some other planet that's evolving, and they've filled that niche of having cognitive abilities and the ability to observe the universe and create technologies. That curiosity, I believe, for those kind of same evolutionary reasons, would be endemic to them as well.
And I'd like to think that they come here as anthropologists, and that, look, we are not going to have much, if anything, to teach an advanced civilization about science or engineering, but they might be much more interested in the abstract things: art, literature, music, poetry, all those sorts of things. So that's what I hope they're here for, or that if they arrive, they will be here for.
Yeah, the physics, they'd be like, we know all that stuff, but
been there, done that.
Show us what you've got that we've never seen.
I think it's interesting.
Like,
it's always interesting to have different people in a room and hear everybody's perspectives and learn from them. So I think, like, if you had an alien in the room, it would enrich the conversation, and we'd have a lot to learn.
Maybe one day we could host a debate with an alien. I mean, if we, if we discover that.
And what questions
never know.
aren't we asking? One fun thing people often ask is, what would you ask an alien? And my answer to that is, I would say, what's the smartest thing I could ask you? Because my point is that would direct us to what is truly important, which might be something that we just haven't thought of yet.
Something I'm still a bit hung up on is what David mentioned about commercial pilots and the fact that there seems to be some kind of stigmatization around reporting sightings. And Nick, I'm curious with you, pop culture depictions, sci-fi, Little Green Men, those interpretations, did they make your job harder?
They made it much harder. And I've personally spoken to many pilots, both military and civilian, who have said that they have had spectacular reports which they never made public because they feared that they would be grounded or that they would find promotion more difficult. So they just kept silent. That's changing, but it's still there. But that's one of the reasons why we changed the terminology from UFO to UAP. No pilot wanted to say, I've seen a UFO, because the implication might be, hey, he's thinking he's seeing little green men. But it's kind of easier to say, I've encountered a UAP, because that has connotations that it's more scientific, that it's more maybe some sort of next generation aircraft or drone.
How did we go though from conspiracy theory, fringe conspiracy theory even, to now official narrative?
Well, I think it's a number of different things, but I think it is the fact that in the United States, for example, the newspaper that first broke the story of the Tic Tac and an associated government program that was looking at that sort of thing was the New York Times.
I remember that.
Yeah, when you have the newspaper of record actually putting this story on the front page, it does change the conversation, and I think that was a good thing.
Yeah, although I also think that in the longer term, I think popular culture has also been helpful. Yes, sometimes there is the fear that you get ridiculed if you talk about green men or UFOs, but because UFOs and green men have been in our popular culture for so long, that means generations now of politicians have also grown up with this. Have seen UFO movies, have watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and because they've grown up with it, you now have also politicians who are more willing to fund space research more broadly, to fund NASA astrobiology program, or to have a congressional investigation into UFOs, because for these politicians, UFOs are not some sort of strange fringe, but it's something that has been on the television screens when they grew up.
I agree, yes. And I think that pop culture is not necessarily always a bad thing. I mean, Steven Spielberg makes his movies with wonder and hope, and science fiction books and films like Contact, of course, was written by Carl Sagan before it was made into the movie. Films like Arrival, again, maybe teach us to approach this from a little bit more of a humble mindset.
David, do you and your colleagues resent that it took governments to make us take this seriously and not the scientific community?
To some degree, in that I think people that pursue astrobiology and technosignature searches are generally, myself included, pretty skeptical of these reports of sort of classified sightings that, that they can't produce any evidence because it's so secretive, and so we're frustrated, as I said before, because we want to see the evidence. And so to the extent that that the public is aware of this topic through these kind of sensationalistic and not necessarily reliable reports, we maybe are a little bit resentful. But on the other hand, if, as you've said, it gets people to think and maybe be open to this idea, and then through that sort of roundabout way opens them to the curiosity and the wonder, and therefore acceptance and maybe even support of astrobiology, then that's a good thing.
Do you think that I think like looking at things from a naturalistic scientific perspective, it has great value because, as you mentioned, like you can discover something that you didn't know before, and somebody imagined they were seeing something that was amazing, and then you come up with a scientific explanation for it. But if in the universe there were phenomena that don't follow the naturalistic process, then merely applying that lens would blind one to the existence of such things. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it's often said that science is sort of dogma free and is self-correcting. And on one level, that's true, but on another level, there are sort of these precepts that we accept, and that we rule out phenomena that aren't subject to examination by our methods, right. And so I think we have to be broad-minded, and sort of always question our assumptions. And if presented with some kind of phenomena that really didn't fit my worldview, then I would have to question that worldview. But I guess that's why for instance, I don't describe myself as an atheist, even though I'm not a practitioner of any mainstream religion. I consider myself, open-minded and interested in other ways of looking at the world. But part of the reason I say that is because I think, requires the humility to realize that we actually are making assumptions, even as scientists, even with that naturalistic worldview. We like to think that we're not, that we don't have any dogma, but that's absolutely not true. You know, if we require things to be verifiable and repeatable in order to exist, what if they're phenomena that aren't?
Exactly.
You know, there's no axiomatic knowledge of that. So it does come down to a sort of way of looking at the universe, even though we often don't like to admit that.
And what gives me hope is that we have indeed, despite all the divisions in the world, that we have people who from different backgrounds, different worldviews coming together, just like we are now around this table here, right? Maybe now more than ever before, for instance, we have scientists and filmmakers entering each other's worlds, right? Where we have films, let's say like Interstellar, where you have a filmmaker like Christopher Nolan working with world-leading scientists like Kip Thorne. It's becoming more and more acceptable for scientists to sort of enter, for instance, the world of pop culture, to enter the world of Hollywood. And it's also maybe more common to have people from religious backgrounds, from theological backgrounds, entering into conversations with researchers, journalists of various disciplines, right? Even like art and science, right? The SETI Institute, for instance, in California, also hosts artists in residence. And I believe that in order to truly explore and understand all the mysteries of the cosmos and all the phenomena that are still unexplained, we need to have all the brains that we have. We need to have people from all backgrounds and with all kinds of trainings asking different questions and offering their insights.
Nick, do you agree?
I completely agree. David's UAP panel were a case in point about probably saw more intersection between NASA scientists and, say, the classified black program intelligence community world. And we see that all the time. I think making this interdisciplinary is a great thing. I mean, chaos theory, I'm not an expert on this, but I believe that the seminal article was actually published somewhat counterintuitively in a meteorological journal. So the lesson is that there are things out there that somebody else knows, and your challenge is always finding who that somebody else is and finding out what they know. And again, AI, if we can get a lot of this digitized, is a huge opportunity here for that.
Well, and astrobiology is inherently interdisciplinary, not just within the sciences, although it's true. It's been a challenge since astrobiology became a field, which is really since the late 1990s, stimulated by that finding of that Mars rock that you mentioned that may have had microfossils in it, which probably didn't, but it really stimulated a movement to take this more seriously scientifically. And it was realized that you needed astronomers and biologists and earth scientists and meteorologists and chemists, and all these people that were used to talking in their own specialized language to work together. And it really has created this interdisciplinary community. And what's happened more recently is that there have been more conversations with philosophers and theologians and sociologists and artists. And actually NASA sponsors this program at the Library of Congress that specifically invites scholars to work at the intersection between the humanities and the sciences, because of recognizing that this subject requires more than just science. So it's a work in progress, but I do feel like those boundaries are loosening up and people are crossing them over because they realize that to grapple with profound questions like this, you have to kind of break out of your disciplinary trenches.
Final question. I'll start with you, Sheikh Hamza. If humanity is not alone, what responsibility does that place on us moving forward?
So if there is intelligent extraterrestrial life, then it's our responsibility to reach out to them, to get to know them, to discover them, and to communicate with them and to convey the message of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to them and have conversations with them, learn their perspectives, learn their language, learn their culture. Yeah.
Matthias?
Yeah, I think it would be the responsibility of on all of us to be just as open-minded as we can, maybe as open-minded as we've never been before, towards that sort of other culture, perhaps that other technology, that other biology as well. So we should essentially tear down all the sort of walls that we have in our head in order sort of to make room for all that sort of is possible when you are in touch with another civilization from another planet.
David?
I think that it would present an opportunity and a responsibility to enlarge our sense of community, to learn as much as we could about them and from them. And even if we can't learn anything specific from them by communicating, I think just the knowledge of their existence would be a tremendous learning experience. And I'd like to think that it would help us confront the notion that we have a responsibility and again an opportunity to survive, and that means solving our problems here on Earth and sort of rising to that occasion of becoming part of a galactic community. And the way to do that is to be more open to one another, in addition to being open to them, and just sort of learn how to get along. And then if we can do that, then the universe is our playground.
Nick?
I think with any defining moment in human history, there are threats and opportunities. The nearest analogy I can think of to discovering that we're not alone, something that came suddenly and unexpectedly from left field and changed all our lives, is COVID, which we mentioned before. So I think in relation to discovering that we're not alone in the universe, the responsibility that we have is not repeating the mistakes of COVID. Let's not make it political. Let's not shout at each other. I like David's point that this is an opportunity. And although there are threats and opportunities, let's focus on the opportunity. Let's talk to each other. Let's be humble. And rather than trying to force our views on other people or shout other viewpoints down, let's listen to each other and let's try to learn something.
Thank you all so much. That was a really interesting conversation. It's going to stay with me for a while. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You've been a great
for
moderator.
joining us. Thank you.
Wonderful question.
Thank you so much. You've been great guests.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.